I'm here with Mr. Bob Dobbs, who I first heard of from the Hermetics podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, listen to both episodes. You did 2 episodes. Um, Fascinating stuff.
Did you
And
hear what happened? He
what happened?
after the first one, which he wanted to talk about McLuhan,
Right.
and we got but then he found out about Ion, so he wanted to talk about that. And so at the end of that, because he's on Patreon or whatever, he gets supported. A lot of his followers said, "Screw this guy. This was a mistake." I forget what his name is, James or something.
Yeah.
And so James sort of had to apologize. And so I said,
Oh,
"Well, James, let's do another one where we just do McLuhan. We won't talk about Ion." So
yeah.
we did the second one more definite, but different. He had people complaining, but there are a lot of people who liked it. But he has
I
to
liked it a
listen to
lot.
his
I liked it a
good.
lot. Yeah, it was great.
Well, he has to listen to his audience. They pay him. He's subject
Yeah.
to what they
Yes.
want. And we never finished the McLuhan thing. That's about a year ago.
Mhm.
And so he said, okay, let's say it was last year ago, October. He said, okay. I said, let's do some more. And he said, okay, give me a couple of months to read some McLuhan books. That was like from October till December,
Yeah.
a year ago. And after a few months into March, I said, "Hey, what's happening? Did you read the books?" No. And then I never heard from him again. So I think he gave up. He couldn't find the time to read McLuhan. Other things happened. So we
Right.
never completed it. So
Oh,
maybe you
well,
can complete it for him, and then
that's a
we'll send it
bummer.
back.
Well, I think we're in luck because I have no patrons, no
Yeah.
paid people to answer to, and I've only really read one McLuhan book, although I'm a big fan. The only book I've read from cover to cover is the Gutenberg Galaxy, which is an
Well, that's a
excellent.
good one to read. It's
It's
a
great.
hard one to read. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
what made you get into it? Me? By hearing me talk about it?
there's a good friend of mine, or I'll say somebody I used to know who became an internet friend of mine. Logo Daedalus on Twitter. Shout out to him. He kind of really got me thinking into McLuhan because I think prior to what he told me, and this was like a couple years ago, he um I just kind of knew McLuhan as I just knew medium is the message, right? That's what
Yeah.
everybody's heard. It was through Cam that I kind of understood that McLuhan was not only a brilliant media theorist, but he was kind of prophetic, and he really kind of saw a lot before it happened, while it was happening.
Yeah.
I think, me personally, I'm very drawn to the types of people who can kind of see what's happening as it's happening,
Yeah.
can kind of follow the through lines. And I feel like McLuhan is a very rare breed in how well he was able to do that and just how accurate so much of what he said was. So
Yeah.
just to finish introductions here. So on Hermetics, you were introduced as McLuhan's archivist, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I'd like to definitely learn about how that happened, the kind of the biographical element, and also just if you can speak more to your own upbringing and your, a bit of your fantastic life, which seems really remarkable.
Yeah.
I don't know this, so far the episodes we've recorded have all been with kind of like Bitcoin SV people. I don't know if you've heard of that. We can talk about that later.
What's SV? SV?
Yeah, BSV, Bitcoin SV, is it's the original Bitcoin. I don't know if
Mm.
you're familiar, but there's
Yeah.
three Bitcoins. There's currently 3 major Bitcoin forks, they're called,
Yeah.
that are competing. So there's BTC, that's the one everybody's heard of. Then there's one called BCH, which forked away in 2017, I believe. And then there's BSV, which the mainstream knowledge is that it forked from BCH in 2018. But that's just when it started, basically existed as a ticker symbol.
Mm.
But all forks, you can trace back linearly all the way to 2009 when Bitcoin first existed. So this podcast has kind of so far been interviewing a number of really interesting people in the BSV space, but it's not limited, you know, to just one thing. The podcast is called World Builder. So, you know, we can kind of, we can imagine what that really means. So,
I'm what that means right now. That's going to be our punchline. How I explained right
yeah.
now that I'm the world builder, as you'll see. It's a very fantastic, unbelievable story. But I don't
Okay.
care. I've been saying it for years. We're proving it now. This past year has been really great for people begin to see what we are doing. So
Hmm.
I'll lead up to that. But it goes back 100 years, you know, this story.
Yeah. Well, let's start from the beginning, please, you
Okay.
know.
Yeah. Well, there's a article by Charles Dickens. You ever heard of Charles Dickens, the famous British novelist from the 19th century?
Yes.
He have you had some university education?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
I've read
So
Dickens. I can tell you that. Yeah.
wow. Okay, so there's a collection called Miscellany, which is his early journalism before he
Yeah.
became a famous novelist. And there's an article in there, something like May 1855, and it's called The Toady Tree. And he talks about these people who have names that all begin end with OBBS. So there's Tobbs, Sobs, Lobs, Mobs, and there's Dobbs. Now, most of them sound like he made up, but he talks about a guy named Dobbs, and he says he was a servant for an aristocrat. And if you were talking to him and he saw someone more important coming in the room, and usually around Westminster, the political base where, you know, a journalist would go to see what was going on. If this Dobbs guy saw someone more important than you, he'd just drop you and run off and talk to the more important minister or whatever.
Yeah.
So so the article is called The Toady Tree. Toady is a slang word, means those that suck up to people, you know, the kind
Okay.
of person people don't like, that just go for symbolism and status and hang out where they can exploit the situation. They don't care about you.
Mm.
Or me. So so he's describing Dobbs as a guy who was the ultimate toady and obvious about it and didn't hide it, but he always seemed to know what was going to happen 6 months before it happened. So he was a strange character. Personally, you know, a bit repugnant, but he knew his stuff and he seemed to be hooked into people on the elite level, including his employer, that were part of, back then they would call it the Illuminati, which is a term that came up in 1776, you know, way back there.
Yeah.
So he seemed to be working for somebody who was part of the so-called manipulators. And back then, in McLuhan terms, it was more a print-based society. So central banking and money was the means to control people through the printing press. And
Mm.
it was pretty well in charge until the telegraph came in 1850s. That brought in an electric dimension, which is simultaneous environment of information. So that made the rigid control, let's say from 1650 to 1850 under print conditions, that was more, you talk imperialistic, colonialist, patriarchal, all those terms of top-down control could be done in the print environment. So so now it's beginning to break up in 1855 when you have this article. And so years ago, my family told me about it, and I looked it up, and I've posted it. Might be on one of my websites, picture of the article. So that's my. I think it's two greats, great grandfather. You know what I mean? I think it's more
Mm.
and more. It's not just one great, two greats. I keep forgetting. I sometimes go back and add it up and figure it out, but then I forget it. You ever notice that there's certain things you can't get right in your memory?
Oh,
Hey,
sure.
there's certain things that you just can never remember it right, even though you remember all kinds of other stuff.
Yeah.
So that's one of them. Anyways, so I grew up in a family that was a butler family for 200 years.
Wow.
And have you ever seen the TV show The Downton Abbey?
Oh, yeah. I love Downton Abbey.
That's exactly my life.
Mm.
Remember the young guy, the stupid young guy goes off to war. I think he gets killed.
Yeah.
That's me, stupid kid. You know, my father was the guy who ran the butler staff in the Downton
Okay.
Abbey.
Are we talking English aristocracy
And
or
no, it was outside France, but it was an English faction. And because
okay.
Paris was headquarters in the 19th century and into the 20th century, they had to live in Paris and
Okay.
near it. So I had a French father and an English mother, and our host, home, the mansion, talked in English,
Mm,
and it was a very sheltered existence. You brought up around the manor, and you don't get out too much. You get around a little bit, but it's rural, and so people are spread out, and you're above the workers on the plantation, even though you're just the lowly butler staff, but you're up in the big house and you have a bit of removal from them.
mm,
So I never went to school, and the household talked English, so I never learned it, never learned French, other than years later when I was an adult, I picked up a bit. So years ago, people say, "Well, Bob, you say you grew up in Paris, so you can't speak French." Well, they don't know it's a cosmopolitan area. There's enclaves of every grouping, nation,
right.
race, and that all over the place. So I was
Yeah.
in the English enclave. So in terms of wealthy influencers, my family was aligned with the Rothschilds. Rothschilds were the leaders of that level, even
Mm,
though they might have been around longer. Not my family, but my employer were around a long time. So that gets into the House of Stuart and the House of Hanover and the British royalty.
yeah.
So, so growing up in that situation, at the end of World War One, so I was born in 1922, February 2nd, 1922, and World War One had just,
You're 100 years old.
yeah, you can see I did a 100-year celebration on February 2nd and a follow-up on February 22nd that's on my website. You can look at, I was up for 3 days or something,
Yeah.
entertaining people on Zoom, on
Okay.
Zoom.
Okay.
So you can see all that.
All
See
right. Well.
all the people claim to be my friends, a lot of infiltrators.
I bet. All right. Well,
Well,
we'll have
wait,
to
so
get
let
into
me
your
continue.
secrets. Yes, please.
Yeah. So at the end of World War One, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed.
Mm,
And before that, and they were the center of it, Vienna and all that, all the aristocratic families were intermarried. All right. So even the Russian family was related to the British family.
mhm,
So when that all collapsed, the oligarchs had weakened intelligence systems because the people, well, whatever you call the 20s, new technologies, it was the heyday of people movements, communist movements, union movements. The people got the emotion of multitude happening because
yeah.
of electric media. So it's always, I always put it in terms of McLuhan. You have to think of the collective technological environment and its effects. So it's quite an ebullient time in the 20s, but then the speed up of economic transactions could not be registered by the old-fashioned accounting firms, and so it all fell apart in 1929, 1930. So we had that depression period, and when society came back out of the depression, as McLuhan used to say, money became public property. That meant the private ownership of money had shifted to governments, and more socialist kind of governments, or more collectivist.
Mm,
And so everybody was guaranteed a basic income or welfare or unemployment insurance in different ways throughout the world, because more and more people were living in cities. So you couldn't have a depression and survive on your farm. So money became public property, and that was the case for 50 years till the late 70s. And the Rockefellers, after World War II, the American faction, they sort of dominated, and they gave out loans to everybody all over the world. AID is one of the main government institutions that people know about, where lots of loans were put out. So it was an imperialism based on loaning and
yes.
debt.
Yeah.
And but the computer speed up of the 70s, um, again, like the 20s, the electric transactions um, were too much for accounting, visual space, or printing press, books and visual organizing of knowledge, uh, couldn't keep up with radio. Then it was even more extreme in the 70s. So the Rockefeller empire collapsed. So you had that period from 79 to 82, high interest rates, high prices for gold, and uh, the way they got out of it is the oligarchy, the ancient oligarchy, which my employer was part of, they never lent money. They only invested. So they're sitting pretty there in 1980 with money. They didn't get collapsed in the debt problems that the Rockefellers had.
Mm,
So with the only ones being with cash, they had to sort of take over. So so Prince Charles had to start going around and be the front man because the British monarchy was the only legitimate monarchy that was still functioning in the public in a powerful way. You know, the rest of them were all sidelined. Um, so, so the city of London and the British monarchy had to be the fulcrum point. So Prince Charles had to go around and start talking to mayors and governors and prime ministers and that, and organizing their money to prop up the world economy. And so that's when I introduced Princess Di to him, that he needed a trophy wife. He needed someone that he could go around and distract everybody while he was doing his work behind the scenes.
Hmm.
So for 10 years, all the aristocrats, the older oligarchy, ran the world economy. And that collapsed in 1992 after the Berlin Wall went down. So that was another major shock. And the computer was really starting to take over on the people's level. So that's where I sort of branched out on my own. I had been working my way up in what I call the Secret Council of 10, which was the oligarchy guys sitting on the sidelines from 1930 to 1980, waiting for an opening to get back in, and none came for 50 years. And that's when there was sort of a world government with the Rockefellers spreading their stuff all over the place.
What
You know what I mean?
what kind of opening are they looking for?
They didn't know, but they knew the principle that technologies upset the establishment.
Hmm.
So they didn't know what technologies were coming unless they had psychics or something, and they had some prophets in their group. But I never met any of those guys. The My family had some interesting documents from mediums that an oligarchy had done 400 years before, and you can see me read from them in a video of me from August 17th, uh, 2000 and 1999, August 17th, 1999, a 2-hour lecture at a UFO Congress. It was my only time I spoke in that world, that circuit.
Hmm.
UFO interested people. And I read from my family documents that I had, which were describing what UFOs were. So I got that through my father. So, anyways, so in the 20s, after the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed and the oligarchies were weakened, my father was brought into the intelligence work of his employer. He did not um, do that before World War One or at the end of World War One, but his boss had less resources. So my father was brought into it, and then I was brought into it in 1944. And I have diaries that you can read. Did you know I have diaries that you can look at when I discuss these things?
I've looked at I've seen your website and I've seen I think what our diary is. I mean,
Yeah,
a lot. It's a lot of stuff
yeah,
going back a
yeah.
long
There's a
way.
long timeline,
Yeah,
long timeline.
yeah.
So, so I was brought into it. So I'm explaining how the economy changed in 1930. Money became public property.
Is that's when Bretton Woods was signed, right?
That was 1944 or 45.
Oh, okay.
That's the end of World War,
That's where I
and
forgot.
that was the setting up of quote the world government, where you know you had a central economic control, the Bretton Woods thing, and if you didn't agree with it, you were on
Hmm.
the skids. But most people agreed with it, and you had a relatively placid time in the 50s into the early 60s. But then newer technology started coming in the 60s, and everything got disrupted again. Um,
Can you speak on a little more on the Council of 10? What is that?
oh yeah, so as a kid, like 1922. So let's say when I'm 6 and 7, late 20s, my father is going to a meeting every now and then. I don't know where he's going, but he would come home, and for a day or so, he'd call me Tim Finnegan. Hey, Tim Finnegan. And I didn't know for 20, 30 years later what that meant. But when I found out is that this is the original Priory of Sion, Sion, that my father's employer was a member of. And so there were these oligarchs, they're sitting around planning about what they wanted to achieve or how to maintain their power. And they've got a crisis in the 20s because it's getting shaky, and money is not public property yet, but it's going to be when there's a collapse, when radio causes the depression, so to speak. So the reason he was saying, hey, Tim Finnegan, is that his boss and the other people, they were looking at James Joyce's early publication of Finnegans Wake, and it didn't have the title back then. It was just called Work in Progress. And it was a scattering of multiple languages on a page. No one ever seen a book written like that. It was absurd. All these indecipherable languages, unless you had a dictionary or something. And but what struck my father's employer was that's what he saw on his desk. On his desk were communications from around the world in different languages.
Mm,
So Joyce was painting the exact experience of these oligarchs. So they were curious about why Joyce was doing this, maybe even suspicious.
mm,
So my father would be talking about Finnegan's Wake with these people and Joyce's work, and they didn't call it Finnegan's Wake, but they knew what it was about, based on an Irish ballad, American Irish ballad about Tim Finnegan. So in the drunken inspiration of the discussions at the prior Scion, he'd come home and he'd have this Joyce stuff in his head. So he'd call me Tim Finnegan. So it was an odd thing. It was like I thought I just had a nickname.
yeah.
So eventually, when I was brought into it, I learned about what they were doing, what they were talking about. And so that's where I found out about Tim Finnegan came from Finnegans Wake, because it was published in 39. So by that time, I could find out, but I didn't find out till 44. So,
Mm,
so in my diary, you'll see we went and visited Hitler in 1936. My father did, and on behalf of his employer. And the deal was, okay, what are you going to do? It's the year of the Olympics. You got high profile. You're looking good. Time magazine did an article on you. What's up? And I have a little bit of an excerpt. Basically, he said, well, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, but I don't want to upset you people too much, because he knew they had a different kind of power that he'd have to bump up against. And I have in the diary my father saying, "Well, we're okay with what you're doing, uh, and we'll let you know if there's any problem." So there was a peaceful stalemate or standoff there,
why were they okay with what he was doing?
because it was now in the period of money as public property. They didn't have the power they had before 1929.
Mm,
The change of technology, electric technology, altered the private ownership of money, which is basically a Gutenberg phenomenon. All right, with bankers and people connecting through central banks around Europe. So that system was upset. So they couldn't just tell Hitler to go screw himself or shoot him. They
right.
didn't have as much power, I would say, but they did have money power if that ever came back, which it did come back in 1980 when the public money system collapsed. And
Mm,
and then the Reagan era came in, and you've had a problem for working class people ever since about how to survive in an inflationary and accelerating digital economy. Everybody had a problem with that. Well, it was a bit of a problem for the oligarchs at the beginning in the 30s. So
mm,
they just stayed on the sidelines above it all and waited to see what would happen. And they spied on everything, and they would go around and check out new technologies. We actually visited Albert Hoffman's LSD lab
mm,
in Switzerland in 1943, I think it was, because he discovered
okay.
it in 38, but he didn't know what he had, and he didn't. Then he accidentally tasted it, or it got inside him. And 5 years later, in '43, and then he had his hallucinatory trips. That week in April '43, we were visiting the lab
Mm,
because we'd heard about what he'd done at Sandoz. So my father, on behalf of the employer, was to check out all possible things that were happening. So these oligarchs were very informed, and their spying kept on technology, kept up on what was going on. And
mm,
that's basically what they did, is just keep tabs of everything to see what would happen. They didn't know what was going to happen, unless they did know, but I don't think they did. That nobody
right.
knows anything really in terms of the real unfolding of reality. It's pretty strange.
Well,
Uh,
my you know somewhat limited understanding, I guess, of Hitler before World War II was that he was very anti-establishment, or the
yes.
anti-Anglo establishment, right?
He was
So,
anti-capitalism. He was a national
yes,
socialist at first. He was
right.
a collectivist, and it became a national collectivism. That's fascism, as opposed to communism, which is a collectivism that tries to be international. So he's a nationalist tribal guy, which is reinforced by radio. And a key point by McLuhan. So this is how we're going to talk about McLuhan at this beginning part, is to show how you apply it. The Germans, the Italians, the Japanese, and the Russians were not as industrially organized as Britain, France, and the United States. So they were more visually biased, you could say, United States, America, and France, and England. So the acoustic effect of radio awakened the tribal acoustic background of the less industrialized parts of the world, like Germany, Italy, and Japan and Russia. So they could get together as a powerful tribe and not worry about private individual identity that were the qualms of conscience that British, French, and Americans had. So the tribal effect of radio made the Nazis and the fascists and the Italian fascists and the communists feel superior to the slow, literate, industrial British, French, and Americans. So in the 30s, they're feeling like they're more powerful, and they then get carried away. They thought they could take over the world. They don't recognize it's really just an effect of radio. If you turned off radio, the Germans go back to having an inferiority complex again, like they had after World War I.
Yeah.
So it's very tenuous, but nobody was going to turn off the radio environment. No one was thinking of that. So Hitler and them took advantage of it. And because America was having a problem of getting out of the Depression, and they had to become more collectivist, and it wasn't until a communist, FDR, Roosevelt, came in, and he's part of the oligarchy of America, but he bites the bullet and he goes collectivist. And there's a coup attempted against him in 1934, and all kinds of enemy. He's like Trump, so to speak. When Trump comes in, he upsets the thing. Everybody hates him. Well, the rich all hated FDR because he was going too collectivist. But he won because in the radio environment made it an advantage to go tribal because it was the new effect.
Right.
So, but they were weak. So Time magazine writes articles celebrating, wow, look at this Hitler guy. He's organized, a lost economy, and they had incredible inflation, and now they're the most developed economy right now, 1935, 36, and maybe we should learn something from him.
Right.
Now, on the secret level of the oligarchy, the Rockefellers were working with the elite in Germany. It was known as the IG Farben drug complex, which later became Big Pharma. So there was secret top-down influences that favored Hitler, and my employer seemed to be a bit going along with that. And so what was I saying? So the Rockefeller supported it, the top-down, what we call the top-down control, and the radio effect. But then there was television coming on. Television gets brought in 1924 or so in England, but it's a mechanical TV, and that's what Joyce used to write about TV in Finnegan's Wake. But there was an electric guy, Philo, forget his last name. He in 37 made an electric TV, and so that was more efficient. So you got this TV effect happening late 30s and into the 40s, and then you have the atomic bomb, and
what would you say is the difference between the radio effect and the TV effect?
Radio is, now that's where you get into McLuhan's terms, hot and cool.
Yeah.
Hot means a lot of information is provided you in high definition, whereas a cool environment has low definition information. So a telephone call is cool because you can't see the person you're talking to, and the phone might be got static and it's muffled. And then black and white TV in the 50s was low definition. It wasn't as precise as Technicolor movies or movies before Technicolor, which were high definition, showed a lot of information. So hot movies and hot radio are a different effect than cool TV and cool telephones. So the effect was there was the kind of music that came in, jazz and swing, high, smooth rhythms, different from the blues, the brothel blues that the music came from. So radio slicked up, being more as an acoustic medium requiring a visual complementary balancing, because all the senses are getting involved. So the acoustic is highlighted, but the visual eyeball comes in to balance off the radio effects. So you get a lot of sleek uniformity and hyper visual effects is in the way McLuhan defined visual bias. But then television has all the senses. It's not just high definition ear, but it's low definition. So that means people get more involved in figuring out the image, what it means, and the processing of it by senses. Do you remember reading that part, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, yeah, I remember
Yeah,
the hot and cool
yeah.
elements, and yeah,
So these are crude categories. McLuhan admitted they were crude, but we're dealing with a new situation. And he was right to say there are effects happening in these media that our politics and economics don't understand. They
yeah,
didn't know that would happen. So radio is a hot medium and TV is a cool medium. Radio is just hearing, TV is hearing, smelling, and watching, and movement, your kinetic sense, cameras moving
right.
rapidly in a way. And so it's very involving.
And
So that's the
it's constantly forgetting the right word, but it's like constantly changing with the times, you know, the temperature, so to speak.
well,
Where
it lives more in the now. It
it's
responds to
constantly
the now.
right, it's constantly getting hot, so what was hot before is colder, you know, and
Yes. Yeah. The radio was a mind blower because everybody could experience the same thing at the same time across the country. You
yeah,
know, the same experience. No medium provided that before.
right,
Movies, everybody could see the same movie, but it'd take a couple of weeks until everybody went to the theaters and saw the movie.
right,
But in radio, whatever the content was available to everybody immediately. So TV brought in the radio simultaneity, but it had this tactile, grainy, semi-visual quality, which was a new dimension.
mm,
And that led to rock and roll. So music changed because of the abrupt tactile interface of television. What you said, the changing with the trends, well, it was abrupt changes. It was responding um, like radio, but people could engage visually
yeah,
and feel things. So you had McLuhan used to give an inventory. He had to go across the culture. What was happening in music? Well, Elvis came in. That was a totally different kind of music from jazz, and in literature, a bunch of kids running hitchhiking across the country made books, you know, the beatniks that
yeah,
upset the literary establishment. And then women had these high beehive hairdos, and
mm,
surfing and scuba diving came in, and the hula hoop, kids doing the hula hoop differently from the 20s kids. So McLuhan would look at these fads and say, well, these are different sensory modalities responding to the TV effect,
mm,
because your sensory complex is always responding to the environment. And if you have this weird new TV effect, your senses are going to remix and change and adapt to the tactile and also counter it just to maintain its own sensory aspect. You know, the ear, the kinesis, a race car driving came in. Um, well, just a popularization. Since television swallowed all the previous media, you had what I call Baroque spirals of abundance. You had more music, more movies, uh, more TV, more golf, more everything, as you had a kind of leisure society. So sociologists would talk about in the 50s, oh, well, obviously we have new abundance led by America since World War II. So we're a leisure society. But that's just two words. And there's a lot of interesting, weird stuff that's going on that you need to look at besides just calling it a leisure society. So McLuhan didn't name the type of society. He just looked at all the different activities and made an inventory and showed what was common to all the different aspects. And so basically, beehive hairdo, rough rock and roll, surfing, swimming, Kennedy with his loose hair compared to Nixon's 40s and 30s slick back lawyer look.
mm,
Okay, so he had a different image, Kennedy, and it bothered a lot of people. They thought that guy's too loose or something. But these were felt needs in the population and how their senses responded. So you do an inventory of the effects, and you see, oh, all these aspects, new things, have what McLuhan defined as tactile qualities, and you had to know what he meant by tactility. tactility was not a sense. It was the interplay of senses. And television was extending the interplay of senses, not the visual sense, not the acoustic sense, not the kinetic sense. A lot of the industry of the 19th century is an extension of the kinetic sense with pulleys and levers, right?
Yeah.
Movement like muscles. That was industry before the electric stuff really took over. So, so that's the difference between radio and TV.
Yeah,
And
it's like Max Ernst versus Pollock or something, you know. Kind of,
yes, surrealism versus abstract. Yeah,
yeah.
Pollock was painting the tactile, non-visual qualities of television. So the changes of the radio era upset the oligarchy. And McLuhan said that with television, Big Brother, which was written up in 48 or so by Orwell's book, 1984,
Yeah.
Reverse of 48, 1984, Big Brother in the TV era went inside. It wasn't in the like in the 30s, the Nazis, the fascists, they marched around in the streets and they'd occupy the public spaces, right?
Yeah.
Well, when the National Security Act came in 1947 in the United States, it said, okay, we're going to have it's an information society now, and we need to control that. And if you're a member of the secret services and intelligence agencies, you can lie to the people, to the citizens of America, if we seem that's necessary to do. So it shifted to what McLuhan, who was onto this, in Gutenberg Galaxy, you would have read it. Big Brother goes inside.
Yeah.
It's not walking around the streets, but it's monitoring the information world. And one of the things the American winners of World War II did, they went around to all the quote third world countries, less developed countries who might start favoring Russia. They said, you set off a bomb in New York or anywheres, we will wipe out your whole race. They had to be tough like that. They said, do not do anything, and you might damage our city or something, but we got a lot more weapons than you have, and we will wipe out. You'll be off the map. You won't exist anymore. So that was the kind of way it was controlled in the 50s and 60s. The way, quote, the world government, the secret global management, which was coming in with Sputnik and the satellite environment, they were very tough, you know, post-human almost. So meanwhile, so that was it. That's a new effect that the my parents' employer, I just call them the oligarchy, had to deal with. That was a new change in power. And
Well,
they were even
I mean, it's almost like you could say that the atomic bomb could not be dropped until there was television, you know, to kind of
well, no, television has stopped it from being dropped. If it was going to drop, because you had this tense period from 46 to 55, where Churchill's named it the Iron Curtain and declared their World War II ally an enemy, the Soviet Union, caused a big problem there. And then the Russians did develop the atomic bomb, and then they did develop the hydrogen bomb. So it was really scary for people in that 46, 47 till 55. Then TV came in. That's a whole new environment. And you have a bit of the abundance coming through of the 50s. And you got kids now, all these kids are going to school and they're listening to the music on the radio. These kids were talking and being seen. They used to be, right? The old cliche, you know, the kid was supposed to be seen but not heard.
yeah.
Now the kids were being heard. You had that movie comes out, Blackboard Jungle, in 55 or so. And Frank Zappa wrote an article on in Life magazine in 68 about the revolution for high school kids to see themselves in a movie and having this sort of rebellious takeover plot. It was pretty heady stuff for kids to see themselves. It's just like when primitive people or Aboriginal people see photographs of themselves, they're really shocked by it. You know, what is that? And a famous story is when this anthropologist gave out books to Aboriginal people. They could not believe that this book looked exactly like the other book and the third book. They'd never seen anything visually be exactly the same. So that's just a simple media effect that's good to know, to show how people are, no matter what sophistication they have in their shamanism or spirituality or whatever other stuff we romanticize about Aboriginal ecological peoples, they did not know how to handle new media effects. These are brand new.
Mm.
So the thing was, in this McCarthy period in the United States, where it was very, it was a threat to your livelihood. If you were named a communist by McCarthy, you were gone. So it was pretty scary. And but the oligarchic employers, they're smart. They're watching what's going on, and they keep tabs on the arts, on avant-garde stuff. And that's why I met a lot of those people as a kid through my father, because he met James Joyce and these people in the 30s. So because he was inclined to be interested in that, and he had to be interested. His employer wanted him to be monitoring all that stuff. So in 1953, December 53, McLuhan put out a magazine with Ted Carpenter. It was
Yeah.
Explorations #1. And in it, McLuhan laid out his definition of how the medium was the message. Didn't have the phrase yet, but he was explaining how technologies alter society more than anything else. You want a key to change, you look at what the technologies are doing. And a lot of people didn't, they just were busy inventing things to solve their food problems and the basic necessities. Get an air conditioner. Wow, that's incredible. You don't have to put up with hot, sweaty summers and all that. So they wanted more of the physical stuff. They weren't noticing the information, intellectual, cultural effects of new media. But since the intelligence agencies always knew, for at least 300, 400 years, that the medium was the message, they understood, let the people have books. Let them be all confused by the books and arguing among themselves and trying to be famous. They'll keep off our backs while we're trying to run a global situation, right?
Yeah.
Through central banking. So, so when McLuhan's essay came out, somebody told my father, and father told me, you need to go to Toronto. You got to find out who this guy is named Marshall McLuhan. We don't know who he is, but he's revealing our secret. The medium is the message. We can't have that.
Yeah.
So I was sent over to first New York, and I don't know if you knew the name Marcel Duchamp. You know
Of
that
course.
famous artist. Yeah.
Yes.
So my father knew Duchamp, so I went to New York in late '53, early '54. To connect with Duchamp because that was my father's connection in New York.
Mm.
And so I had some neat experiences for a couple months in New York City. Then I went to Toronto in early '54. So I introduced myself to McLuhan.
So all of the sort of New York modernist artists of that time, like the urinal was displayed, I think, at some whatever the modernist exhibition in the 20s or whatever. All of those
1917.
all of those artists were connected to the Council of Ten and the oligarchy.
No, no, they weren't. No, they didn't really know about it. Wyndham Lewis figured out, and he wrote about it. If you want to read about it, he read his book, 1930, called The Apes of God, where he exposes the oligarchic level in London society. And these particular artists, Virginia Woolf and her buddies, called the Bloomsbury Group, they were more controlled by the oligarchy, what you were just expressing. And they were like the first, and Wyndham Lewis wouldn't go along with it, so he exposed it, and then they hated him from that point on. But his book's incredible. So, so you were talking about, oh yeah, so the artists, it depended on, I mean, my father befriended these people. Other people were just studying Phineas Wake in their meetings, and they probably didn't care about Joyce. They weren't interested. They said, what is this oddball doing? But my father, he was generally a pretty interesting guy. You know, he had an open mind, and he didn't want to just be a butler. And he had a big effect on me. And you'll see in my diaries, my dialogues with my father, he got me ready for the post-intelligence world. In the late 50s, he saw what was happening. He knew that, nobody would have a power anymore, like the Big Brother sense, whether it was outdoors or indoors. So, so we're talking about how
You went to meet Duchamp.
yeah. So these people now, Duchamp knew oligarchs. He did, but he was a gadfly. Nobody even knew he was an artist. I mean, his final work he did secretly for 20 years, from 46 to 66, and he quit art in the 20s after he did the large glass, and he just sort of was a dealer. It was easier to do that because he recognized that what I call Gutenberg art, painting and sculpture and music, was kind of obsolete.
Mm.
He was tuned into it. Now, he read a book in the 20s, and along with James Joyce, called The Meaning of Meaning, a really important book, came out in 1923 by these two. Well, one guy was a Cambridge professor, I.A. Richards, and the other guy, Ogden. I don't know where he taught. Maybe he was at Cambridge too. So they did this book, Meaning of Meaning, and they met an anthropologist named Malinowski in 1922 when they were going to put the book out. And he had just come back from the Pacific Ocean with tribes in there, and had a whole new idea of communication. And he came up with the idea of phatic, PHATIC communication, or phatic communion, McLuhan called it. So they stopped the publication of the book in 22, got Malinowski to write an essay explaining the phatic communication. And then they stuck that on as an appendix. So that came out in 1923. Duchamp and Joyce, who became aware of each other pretty quickly through a common person, Peggy Guggenheim, who was a rich kid over there hanging out in Paris, like rich kids were supposed to do. And so they both read about phatic communication, and that influenced their art. So so that's why Joyce kind of gave up on art. Finney's Wake is not a normal book, and
Wow.
Duchamp was. So they were influenced by this important book. If you never heard of it, The Meaning of Meaning.
Mm.
I was just looking on page 265 of Finnegan's Wake. We were doing it last night on the radio show. And there's the meaning of meaning. And Joyce stretches out the letters. So it's the meaning of meaning, and so it's right there embedded in that page.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, some artists were involved with the richer classes, because the richer classes supported art, but they didn't really interact knowingly with the secret networks. No one really knew about the networks.
Mm.
They knew about Rothschild, and they just thought it was just him and his family. They didn't know that this stuff went back historically,
Yeah.
because these aristocrats had bloodlines, and they made sure the marriage lineage was very disciplined, and they didn't bring any foreign or common people's blood.
Mm.
So some people notice that, but people are peasants. They're living in little villages, working on the farms. They don't know nothing really. They
Yeah.
don't see what's going on in London. They can't even read. So, so here's the point. I get assigned to McLuhan, and I'm to find out, where did he get this? So you'll see in my diary entries, I have a few conversations in the early 50s with McLuhan, and I'm pretending I'm interested in his work. All right. And I probably present myself as kind of like a journalist, but not precise.
Mm.
So I found out pretty quickly that he was really influenced by Wyndham Lewis.
Right.
And that was the first coincidence in my life. I'm sent over across the ocean, and these were wide distances back then, to see this strange culture and this strange guy who somehow knew about what my father and them were doing. How the hell did that happen? And I find out it's Wyndham Lewis, and my father knew Wyndham Lewis. So that was the first, it's a small world kind of connection in my life. You know what I
Mm.
mean?
Yeah.
I go to find out, who is this strange reality? How did you find this out? Oh, we got it from your brother, Bob. Your brother told us. Oh, you know my brother? Kind of thing. So, but it was a friend of my father's. So I spent the 50s occasionally going to Toronto and talking to McLuhan to get a sense of what he was saying and doing, to see what my employers were going to do about it. Now I'm employed. I'm not working for my father. I'm not really a butler kid anymore. I'm
Mm.
out there as an intelligence agent, but it's very casual. We're not out there fighting communists or busting people for this and that. We're just leisurely. We're the leisure class. We're sitting around just aware and ready to look into all the new exciting things that are happening. So years later, I found out that, the week we were there with Hoffman, and the inventor of LSD is the famous week that everybody romanticizes, when he did the bicycle ride and had the effects. He said, "Whoa, what's happening to me?" And discovered what it was been in his lab for 5 years that he
Mm.
hadn't touched. So, okay, so McLuhan, I learned through McLuhan all the writers that he's interested in. And one of them was a guy named Peter Drucker,
Mm.
who became Mr. Advisor to corporate management, like the top guy in the 60s and 70s. And he wrote books. But if you knew McLuhan stuff, he was using McLuhan, watered down McLuhan, to be an interesting consultant. And we find out in his biography that he heard McLuhan speak about 1940, and he said, and this Peter Drucker is a smart guy. He's from Germany. He
Mm.
says, if you could see what McLuhan was saying, he was saying the meaning of the message before he said those words. But he was talking about the effect of technologies in an early, crude way. But you can even see in McLuhan's writings in the 30s as a student at the University of Manitoba, he was sort of on to this international forces that were happening. So, so I'm, what was I saying there? So,
What do you think? What do you think was McLuhan's attitude towards the rapidly changing, technology? Was it? Did you think that it was? I know you've. I from reading him and from what you were saying on the Hermetics cast, you get the impression that he was he advocated somewhat of a Luddite approach to just kind of detach and completely unplug from everything. But
okay, I have a good answer for that. But let me just, I was saying that McLuhan, we finished the part about about Drucker. So Drucker goes on and he puts out a book in 1979 called Adventures of a Bystander. And he explains the main people in his lives. And he writes about McLuhan and Bucky Fuller in one essay. But he also writes about Fritz Kramer, who is the double Nazi agent who controls Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. So on the top-down conspiracy level, that's very important. And Drucker was the guy who brought Kramer over to America. So later, that became very important. And I had met Fritz Kramer in '44. You'll see that in my diary. So Drucker is an interesting guy. And by the 1970s, McLuhan was telling his main colleague, a former British intelligence guy called Barrington Nevitt, they said we gotta do an article on our friend Peter Drucker, and they titled it "The Man Who Came to Listen." In other words, they're saying this is a guy who came, hung around. He didn't contribute much. He just listened to me and was a good memorizer and used my stuff, and then went on to get a big reputation in corporate management, which would be too. McLuhan could be he did do corporate consulting, but he's an artist. He's into all kinds of stuff. He's not gonna just be a businessman.
Right.
So now back to your question. You have to see that McLuhan was a kind of a nerd. There's one woman who went to high school with him in Manitoba, Winnipeg, and said he was uncomfortable and nerdy. Didn't use the word nerd in her generation, but basically said he was a guy the girls had stayed away from. He was an idiot. He was a bookworm, So he had this very conservative streak in himself and superiority complex. So in the 30s, he converts to Catholicism 37, and he's an extreme Catholic. Like he wants to go back to the medieval period. The last 400 years was a mistake,
Yeah.
And when he went, he wasn't a Catholic yet when he went to Cambridge in 34 to 36, but he was reading all the Catholic philosophers and getting ready to become a Catholic in 37. But he told his professors in England, your whole country, your whole culture is one big mistake. You guys left the Catholic Church, with Henry VIII, and you created Protestantism. That was stupid. Protestants made you dumb. And so that's how crude he was. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In telling this culture that the whole thing is a sham, and he has some special insight into Catholicism. So yes, he is the extreme Puritan, old-fashioned fuddy-duddy guy, irrelevant to the world, basically. Now, I have a friend, Clinton, who's a young kid who befriended Andrew McLuhan, who gave Clinton permission as a new person, young guy, about 30, interested in McLuhan, gave him access to the McLuhan archives in Ottawa, in Canada. The stuff that
which Clinton? Bill?
no, this is a kid, Clinton Ignatoff.
Okay, gotcha.
It's a guy,
Yeah.
a kid. We joke about him. He's a gay beer salesman in Ottawa. He works at one of those in the corner of the street, dispensaries. Maybe it's even part of the liquor
I wouldn't be surprised if Bill Clinton was a reader of McLuhan, because I think he said that his favorite writer was Carol Quigley. I might be wrong on that, but
oh yeah, well that was his professor. That's a
really?
conspiracy. That's the top-down knowledge, tragedy and hope. But I have proof for you. One of Marshall McLuhan's brighter students Bruce Powe, Powe, who was a student in the last years of McLuhan, 79 and 80, 78, 79, 80, and I met him there at the Monday night seminars. He became a novelist and essayist and a well-known Canadian writer. What were we just talking about? The McLuhan, what's the McLuhan angle? I forgot what I was supposed to say about Bruce. What were you just saying?
So
What
you were saying we were talking about your friend Clinton, who
the Clinton aspect. Yeah. So Bruce, through his friends at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, when Bill Clinton became president, he came to a meeting with the Canadians carrying Bruce's latest book. And he says, does anybody know this book? You guys know this guy. He's brilliant. I want to meet him.
Wow.
And so Bruce started to correspond with Bill Clinton about McLuhan, confirming your suspicion.
Wow. Okay.
And those letters are now in the National Archives, the correspondence between Bruce and Bill Clinton 30 years ago, early 90s.
Yeah.
But Clinton was, we don't know what exact, Bruce might know. I haven't read the correspondence, but the discussing, I don't know how much McLuhan was discussed, but I'm sure Bruce did it because that's what he was an expert on and did books on McLuhan. So Bill probably quizzed him about McLuhan, but he also was interested in the way Bruce applied McLuhan, I think. So that's very, very sophisticated to go to a bunch of Canadians and 90% of them never heard of Bruce, you know, and this guy say, are you guys reading this book that your compatriot wrote? No, we don't even know the guy. Well, get hip. I'm telling you, Canadians, catch up on your own culture, you know? So that correspondence, I would like to read it someday. It'd be interesting. But there's your point. Bill Clinton was on. Well, he was on it, man. He was on what was happening.
He smart guy, no doubt.
Right. Now back to Clinton Ignatoff. He befriended Andrew McLuhan, who gave him permission to look at all the archives of McLuhan written in the 40s that us regular McLuhan scholars weren't allowed to see for some reason. We never had permission to see it, but Clinton did. So Clinton started telling me what he was reading. And he said this McLuhan, he was the most arrogant, superiority complex Luddite. He dismissed everybody. You get a bit of it in Mechanical Bride, but it was more extreme. He had to temper down his Mechanical Bride, which was written from 46 to 51, and he was very extreme in 46. And the advertising industry found out about it, and they started trying to suppress the book. It was called The Mechanical Bride, and his publisher were having a problem with him. And he was writing in his letters to friends. He's like, got a sore gut for 5 years. He got, you know, all sorts of something, worrying about all this. He really was finding it hard to figure out how to be an acceptable intellectual for Canadian culture. But yes, you read that stuff, and Clinton's read some of it to me. It is extreme. And he suddenly, and people who read him, they couldn't believe the guy in the 50s. The guy who, it was like he got possessed by a ghost, and he was the exact opposite, or very different in his writing in the 50s, not a Luddite anymore. He reserved judgment about whether technologies were good or bad because the effects they were doing were too disturbing, and we need to be aware of the effects, or we're going to have an accidental nuclear war if we don't know what we're doing.
Right.
So that's the change. Yes, he was definitely a Luddite, and Barry Nevitt, who knew him well, not when he was young, but he said basically McLuhan was a moralist in the 30s and 40s, and he was interested and joined the moral rearmament thing. So these guys, so he was a very, you know, if you're a relatively liberal, party-loving guy, you know, in college or something, McLuhan was the kind of guy you would avoid, right?
Yeah.
He was the nerd. He was there going to church, for God's sakes, while you're partying. What 20-year-old would do that, right?
Yeah.
Go to so he was that kind of person, apparently, even though privately he was very smart and had a really good sense of humor because he was reading advanced humor like Joyce and Lewis. So he was hipper than people realized, but he didn't present himself that way. And so he's totally different, his public image in the 50s.
He could probably see through the facade of what is cool, you know, like the idea of cool, you know.
That's right. Well, like communism was popular in Cambridge in the 30s when he was there. All those famous guys that became spies. I don't know if he knew them, but he knew the trend among the kids, and he thought they're stupid, man. This is ridiculous. Come on,
Yeah.
get back to Christian capitalism or something, you know.
Right. Right.
Like
Yeah.
he was a follower of G.K. Chesterton, who was a a guy who
Distributist. Yes.
distributionist or something,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That is the economic system of the Catholic Church, basically.
yeah.
Or
How did you
the
know that?
Oh, I read Chesterton. I like
Oh,
Chesterton.
did
I'm
McLuhan? You read Chesterton before McLuhan?
uh yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Well, you were getting yourself ready to deal with McLuhan. You didn't know it
Yeah. Oh yeah.
because yeah, Chesterton's a big influence on McLuhan. He met him while
Yeah.
he was at Cambridge. He was very impressed with the way
Oh
he
wow.
was. He has some interesting descriptions of him in his letters of the way he presented himself to the cult of Chesterton, whatever community organizing he was doing.
Right.
So uh, so McLuhan was an interesting person. When Gertrude Stein came to Cambridge, and this is written up in Philip Marchand's biography, the first biography, he attacked her. Here's this famous French intellectual, American
Yes.
French, coming to Cambridge. All the students are into it. This is cool. And this
Yeah.
nerd gets up and quotes Wyndham Lewis, who had written bad stuff, negative stuff about Gertrude. He does a Wyndham Lewis on her. And I think she walked out. She got off the podium, walked up to him right in front of him and confronted him.
Oh man.
Yeah. And so there's a
That's great.
standoff between McLuhan and Gertrude
That's
Stein.
absolutely
And
great.
yeah, and he
She was definitely an instrument of the oligarchy or the CIA or whatever.
Well, there's a school of thought that would place, have you ever read Lyndon LaRouche? You ever heard of Lyndon LaRouche's
I've heard
material?
the name. I'm not, I haven't read the material. Yeah.
Well, what you just said is totally what he says. He talks about how British intelligence took over American cultural thinking at the end of the 19th century through the Fabian socialists, George Bernard Shaw, and other people.
Mm,
So they took over the curriculum and they dumbed down the natural, technologically oriented schooling called economic system, the American system in education in America, and they got rid of that, especially when they come in with the Federal Reserve. So that's another locking down of a world government situation.
right.
And yeah, definitely they're infiltrating the Paris scene with Gertrude Stein. They bring in Gnostic kind of religions with William James. And she was related
Mm,
to Gertrude Stein was related. What, he was a professor of hers or a mentor or something.
mm,
And then there was Henry James, the novelist who wrote about European culture
right.
and talked about the financial elite and all that. So LaRouche would say that starting with Charles Dickens, uh, that
Mm,
whole bunch of British stuff that's mandatory in education in the 20th century in America, all that British dominated novelists and poets was all British intelligence, which took over the CIA. And so you're right to say it's the CIA, but it's before the CIA. It's
yeah.
in the 30s. Gertrude Stein, and LaRouche has a whole aesthetics saying you got to be a Platonic artist, and only the greats were all Platonic. If you start getting into social issues and even though LaRouche was a Marxist, he eventually dismissed the lefty kind of culture because it got into sensory hedonism and the fads of the 20th century and was missing the Platonic tradition.
Mm,
So, LaRouche would say there's no culture since Beethoven or a couple of composers after Beethoven,
sure.
and
Yeah.
definitely nothing in the novel world. The novel world, that's ridiculous. A bunch of gadflies hanging out with rich people like Somerset Maugham and people like that.
Hmm.
So if you want, you just need to go to the executive intelligence publications, and you'll see their front page. You go down to the bottom, and in the small letters it says search. You click on search, and you type in Charles Dickens or anything, and you'll get all their articles they built up the last 50 years. They're a real university, a cult / university with
Mm.
incredible historical stuff. If you want to follow that thread, and what was
It was
wrong with
very
G.K.
interesting.
Chesterton. Yeah, it's very interesting if you're interested in all kinds of ideas.
I
I
am
always
certainly.
recommend LaRouche. Yeah, and
And
it's all organized there for you.
I just want to ask if you're, I'm very curious, going on like the Gnostic ideas thread, if that bled into kind of like Rudolf Steiner and like
That's
California New Age theosophy and all that sort of thing. If you're
Yeah,
aware
that's
of it.
all Gnostic.
Yeah.
Uh, the Gnostic was a historical thing at the time of Jesus, or even before.
Yeah.
It was just now. I have a McLuhan theory. Since religion, well, tribal Homer and pre-Homer religion was more of a ritual, dancing, chanting, taking plants and shamanism and stuff like that. When the alphabet came in and brought in this novelty of abstract thinking in the front of the brain, the
Mm.
phonetic alphabet caused that. Then everybody dropped the Dionysian kind of religion, and they went for the abstract Apollinean, which led to Christianity, and the Jews came out of that, and Islam came out of that. The
Yeah.
alphabetic effect.
Right.
So the abstraction. Now, if you were a kind of personality in at the time, let's say 100 BC or BCE, you would not like these new alphabetic kind of guys, and you have nostalgia. If you were a Terence McKenna kind of guy, you have nostalgia for drug taking of that. It's just the way it
Yeah.
was in your
Yeah.
personality. So you would try to retrieve the drug kind of religions, the experiential kind of
Yeah.
shamanism.
The ecstatic
Yeah,
experience. Yeah. Type religions. Yeah.
yeah. McLuhan called the millenary ecstatics, coming to the millennium, millenary ecstatics.
Mm.
Um, so you would form a thought pattern, an intellectual framework for this stuff, and you would abstract the forces of good and evil and make them equally canceling each other out, and you wouldn't be so moralistic like the Christians,
Right.
and you would try to retrieve the involving Dionysic aspects of whatever you come up with. So Gnosticism, I say, is a newly literate, visually biased society, some parts of it trying to get back to the oral, pre-literate fun. You know what
Mm.
I mean?
Yeah.
That's Gnosticism.
Right.
And so, of course, the Christians say that was bad. That was evil to be that way. So Gnostics
Yeah.
were always on the fringe. But so you had that thread all through 2,000 years. And, there's a lot of books now that go through the history of all that stuff. People know more about all the various characters of 2,000 years. But definitely the 19th century is Theosophy, Rosicrucianism, and
Yeah.
then the 20th century, just Aleister Crowley and the occult stuff. All that McLuhan looks down on.
Right.
He is not a Gnostic, and he writes exposing Gnostic influences, all kinds of writers and
Yeah.
poets.
It's a
So
very Catholic thing to do.
yes, but he was unique. Now here's what was different. There were other Catholics that was traditional to be against the Gnostics, but McLuhan brought in the new information society. There was a new factor that was making these fringe Gnostics, they were going to take over
Mm.
because the cool electric mishmash of tactility favored drug taking. At first, you have it in the jazz world, then you have it in the hippie world with LSD and all that stuff, and then the yuppie world is cocaine, and it never stopped. Now it's fentanyl. Everybody's dying from it.
Right.
So and they can't. They're all addicted to it. So McLuhan predicted that drugs would take over. So as a Catholic, trying to at least not be an isolated Catholic, have a bit of public responsibility, his first essays he kind of writes and says, "This is for my Catholic brothers here in Toronto, or my Catholic." Whoever would read him in the Catholic journal called Renaissance,
Mm.
and so he would expose Gnosticism, but he said we got to. It's not an idea anymore. It's a preference in people's sensory makeup today to go Gnostic,
Yeah.
and a lot of the Protestants who remember they read the Bible. Catholics never read the Bible in the medieval period. Didn't have it. The
Sure.
people.
Yeah.
But Protestants came in and started reading, and then they formed this fragmented individualistic philosophy with a Christian spin on it. And so they're visually biased more than Catholics. And you'll see a lot of New Age people come out of Protestantism or are Jewish.
Right.
They do not come from the Catholic so much, though there are Catholic hedonists, but it's in general, it's a Protestant effect
Yeah.
that sets you up to want to be a Gnostic when television gives that desire to become Gnostic in
Mm.
experience. Rock and sensory interaction at high volume. That's Dionysiac. So that's McLuhan on Gnosticism. With my original take there about Gnosticism is an alphabetic effect.
Yeah.
you know, back in the
Well,
day.
I think that's really fascinating because I always probably the greatest insight that I've taken from McLuhan that's really lasted with me is this idea of language as a technology as well, you know.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
and
yeah.
I'm going to go into it, and that leads into the next aspect of McLuhan that people didn't know at the time when he was popular. But you had to go to the coach house in Toronto. You got to hang out with him to find out the secret stuff of McLuhan and what was behind his art and all kinds of stuff. And you would eventually find out about something called Menippean satire. Have you come across that phrase associated with McLuhan? Menippean.
I don't think so, no.
Yeah, it's Menippean, based on a
It's a
guy.
Greek. It's a
Yeah,
Greek. Yeah.
yeah. Menippus was a Greek guy, 220 BCE, who was outrageous. He mixed prose with poetry. You don't mix those two, right?
Yeah.
They're very fragmented when the alphabet comes in. You know, everybody sticks in their specialist. Being a specialist was a novelty.
Yeah.
Not being tribally inclusive. So this idiot Menippus said, "Screw you guys." Maybe he's a Gnostic. He's not going to mix them up.
No.
And he also was aligned with the philosopher Diogenes, who was created cynicism.
Yeah.
So Menippean satire is a rare genre of humor and satire where it doesn't satirize public figures or human foibles. It satirizes the reader of the book that you're writing for them. I'm satirizing you. I can be. People have looked at my interviews and Bob's a Menippean satirist when he does his interviews. Like I might have appeared to the Hermetics guys.
That's
They're
great.
his
It's like
audience.
the first troll, you know,
Yeah,
trolling.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
excellent. Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
It's an ancient art, really.
That's right. It's
Yeah.
actually the holdover from the you see the mask of the tragic and the comic, the Greek
Yeah.
mask that comes
Right.
in with visual space, and theater comes in. Before that, they probably were. It was Comedy Central 24/7 because there are all these cynical guys running around fucking satirizing each other. It's
Yeah,
just like
absolutely.
it's like Saturday Night Live and all that now. Our society went that way, where everybody is a comic, a comedian, a cynic.
Right.
Because in McLuhan terms, there's nothing but information overload. So you're trying to make patterns. So comedy just became people making patterns of what was going on and trying to make it funny. So
Mm.
everybody became. That's one of my theses I started developing the radio in the 80s and 90s on the radio, that everybody was becoming a Menippean, super cynical. And
Mm.
they called the 80s the age of irony, and the Church of the Subgenius came out of that, the
Right.
ironical. That's a church of Menippeans. So McLuhan was a Menippean satirist. He read about it, discovered it, said, "Yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll make fun of everybody." And he writes a letter in the collection of letters, June 22nd, 1951, and he explains that I will take on the triggermen. That's the Henry Kissinger elite, the big brother that's inside the intelligence services. He says, "I'll take them on. I'm going to distract the triggermen." So he's going to create a whole idea, not a judgmental thing, but he's going to be a new guy. The
Mm.
rare intellectual comes out and talks about things without value judgments. That was new. And he would say things like, I don't know what I think until I say it. And 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 if I talk about something, that doesn't mean I'm for it. And nobody, oh, geez, everybody thought when you talked about something, you were for it.
Yeah.
So he had a very detached way of describing what he was doing because he was detached and put it on as a Menippean satirist. And he said, "I'll distract the triggerman with what? Distract the triggerman." So to pick up, so I was just explaining Menippean satire and
Yes.
how McLuhan writes this letter in June 22nd, 1951 to Ezra Pound saying, "I'm going to distract the triggerman with something on the side." In other words, I'm going to say content has no effect. The medium has more effect. And that was a shocking thing to say to literate, content obsessed people.
Yeah.
That was their natural bias in the West. So he said, "I'll distract the elites. I won't be criticizing them as a communist or a conservative or something. I'll criticize them on a level they don't even understand, right?"
Yeah.
But he didn't know that they did understand that. Remember, I'm brought over. Oh, this guy knows the medium is the message. We know what he's satirizing. And he said, I will needle the people. He called them the somnambulists. So he's going to needle the people, saying, you guys are opinionated working class, get with all this new affluence and drive around nice cars. You abandon your unions and you're into golfing and all the wonderful things that the Leisure Society brought in. And you're just dupes of the new media. So I'm going to make fun of you people. So he makes fun of the elite and the quote working class,
Right.
the middle classes. And so that's all a Manipian put on, right? Very detached. So Eric McLuhan, his son, did his PhD on Manipian aspects of Finnegan's Wake. It's called Manipian Thunder. There's 10 long phrases in Finnegan's Wake, what we call the thunders. So he showed them as the key to Joyce's Manipian satire. But he, in the book, in the PhD at the end, he lists about 60 characteristics of Manipian satire. And one of them is treating language as a technology. So for me, that was one of the earliest major insights of McLuhan was language is a technology. You don't have that language and humanism split from science and technology. They overlap. And then that gives you a new way to operate intellectually, like McLuhan did. You're not fighting on the old alphabetic. It's called C.P. Snow was the guy who wrote about the two cultures, that the scientists weren't talking to the humanists. The novelists weren't talking to the guys working on the Manhattan Project. So so McLuhan figured out how to talk to both of them and satirize both of them.
Yeah.
So
wow, that's
language
fascinating.
as a technology.
Yeah.
You've just learned that is a key Manipian. Language isn't necessarily a technology. Most people don't see speech as technology, right? Technology is bulldozers and stupid big machines, not this wonderful thing that you kiss with.
Well, it's really the it's the tactility. That is how it develops, and efficiency.
Well, not efficiency. That's mechanical. But McLuhan would say the tactile nature of TV, it retrieves our tactile awareness, so we start thinking of language as tactile. So McLuhan was the first to say language was tactile. And then that explains Finnegan's Wake, which has all the senses piled in on each page, so we can have a tactile effect in the book. All literate biased writers aren't aware of the media that way. So they didn't write like Finnegan's Wake. But so McLuhan is a Manipian, and a key point is the idea that language is technology. And you would never know McLuhan said that or thought it unless you found Eric's PhD and read it and found that little note at the back, which I did. I was one of the first to read it in 82, 83. So I asked him, what did your professors who were down in Dallas, what did they think of this PhD, which is pretty amazing PhD? He said they probably didn't even read it. And so that's the way college was in the late 70s, early 80s. You're starting to have information overload. Everybody's getting lazier. The professors got all these stupid baby boomers coming in, and they have to handle all their papers and that. It's just too much. So they didn't read half the stuff that they were supposed to be marking. But if you didn't read Eric's thesis, you missed a lot. Because I maintain it's very important to understand McLuhan, like you've realized. It's something that is a key to what's going on. That's better than anybody else's analysis.
Better than anybody else is definitely, that's the key here. I mean, I think
and he is the main guy from the 60s who's still looked at. Is anybody reading Tim Leary? Only druggies, maybe. Whatever other guys, Noam Chomsky, whatever other guys that were in the 60s, they don't have any staying power like McLuhan does. Every generation discovers McLuhan. And especially now, the whole world is McLuhan incarnate with the internet and all that, which has happened. Now I say that Arthur Croker, who was a good student of McLuhan, he takes it further than McLuhan. If you haven't read Croker, he's the next guy to read. Kroker. And then you listen to me, what I say, overlaying Croker or using Croker. I'm one of Croker's better students. I use his stuff. Not many people do it. They don't understand it. But it definitely goes further in a more complex media environment than McLuhan's day. Frank Zagroni, who grew up across the street from McLuhan and was a student of McLuhan's in Toronto, he was a professor at York University in Toronto, and he told me in the 90s he had always taught McLuhan, but McLuhan's understanding media didn't communicate to the kids. They didn't experience TV and radio as separate things. They
Right.
experienced stuff that was in their Palm Pilot or in their computer.
Right.
So they didn't even have the same media categories. So just being knee-jerk students who have to be fed things and has to match their experience or they don't fucking care about it, you couldn't make McLuhan match their experience. And that's Ingroni who wrote books with Eric McLuhan on McLuhan,
Yeah.
promoting him. But he said it was pretty useless in college. So that was good to find that out from a professor because I wasn't an academic. I didn't know what they were thinking, but I was a friend of Frank, so he told me that. That's a very important insight. So I developed my 5-body model to bring it up to date, to bring McLuhan up to date. And Croker also talks about multiple bodies.
Hmm.
So that's what we would get to if we kept talking here.
Yeah.
But
Well,
now we're doing McLuhan,
yeah.
and so we've he was a Puritan nerd. Then he learned. Then he took his natural sense of humor and detachment and indifference to what people think, and put on a manipulative strategy of changing his position, which shocked the intellectuals that knew him in the 40s. What the hell is this new guy who's so, morally lax? He doesn't have any value judgments. He's out saying what's good and bad, which is what everybody did back then.
Right.
And he doesn't even know what he's saying until he doesn't know what he thinks until he says it. So there's McLuhan being a Manipian, but that attracted among the younger people his sense of humor, his flippantness, his uniqueness attracted a lot of attention
Yeah.
on the colleges. So we went through this change, and then we explained how that's manipulative satire, and that language is a technology, is a manipulative technique. Now those are basic insights. It took us a long time in the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s to find out. You know what I mean? McLuhan
Yeah.
wasn't telling us. He wasn't helping anybody. And you didn't have access to his letters where he spelled out a lot of stuff to his buddies. So it took a while. So I ended up on college radio in Toronto talking about McLuhan in the mid 80s when no one cared about McLuhan. He was suppressed. And people thought he was irrelevant. Even though he predicted Ronald Reagan would be president. He actually did predict all this stuff
Hmm.
that the Generation X was living through. And so I was the only guy in the world talking McLuhan in a public medium. So I actually got a lot of attention because I did that, but I knew how to use McLuhan. And by that time, the letters had come out. I had really taken my own private experience with McLuhan, saw I got access to the archives after he died, and to his essays and the early stuff. So I was very informed more than most people, and also I had become his archivist in at the end of his life. So I had a lot of advantages to have a unique radio talk show, and the Adam Vaughn, who is a local well-known guy because his father was a big TV personality in Toronto local media, and he went into politics, and he was a news journalist himself. He told a friend of mine, like 8, 9 years ago, that Bob was. We didn't get along eventually, me and Adam, but Adam, he said Bob was a genius. He was the first to get onto McLuhan. So I thought that was smart that he recognized that because his father was a friend of McLuhan. They lived near McLuhan, and Adam, he experienced McLuhan as a kid. He would come and visit his father in his home. Now, as a kid, he didn't know really what that meant, but he had that memory. So later, when he heard me on the radio doing McLuhan, he was interested. But I thought he kind of was just into me and McLuhan as a fad. I would never think he'd say, well, it was really important what Bob was saying back then, and we should have listened because he was ahead of his time for the internet, which hadn't come yet. So, in Wired magazine and all that. So,
Hmm.
it surprised me to hear that he had that kind of detached statement about me, that quote, Bob's a genius. He was on to McLuhan.
Right.
And so I would say, not a genius, I just had the experience, as I was telling you, of advanced involvement in society through my employers in the secret council of 10. That gave me advantage of knowing stuff. And then meeting these people. Oh, yeah. So to finish, so I met McLuhan and I'm spying on him and telling my bosses what he's thinking and saying. But gradually, by the end of the 50s, I'm starting to realize this guy knows something that's important. Society's changing, and my boss doesn't know this, or he doesn't
Mm,
seem to know it. So you'll see dialogues with my father about this. My father saw something was happening. We're becoming a global information society. What is the role of espionage? What information is hidden from the people? What part do you hide? And so, as McLuhan said in the 60s, to start journalists categorizing left versus right, that was handy categories for their daily demand to make copy for their journalism. They had to
right.
quickly put together articles. So they have these handy categories, which actually didn't mean anything anymore, left, right. It goes way back to the 60s.
Yeah.
So I knew that through experience in intelligence that these categories didn't work. So um, I had a detachment. I had a detachment which would help me be a Manipian when that occurred to me. Because when you get on the radio and you're trying to tell people something, and then naively, most people, they think they got a message, so they get on some media. This is back in the 80s when you get on local TV, public radio, and you
Yeah.
want to tell them all the great stuff you know, and you quickly find out nobody gives a shit. What the fuck? You're not talking to anybody. Nobody's hearing you. If they are, you're just a passing thing that they can turn on and off.
Right.
So after a while, you say, okay, I can't be a sincere guy trying to tell you something. I'm going to have to get funny or weird or Manipian and have a different strategy. And
Yeah.
so that's what I developed,
Mm.
a different strategy. And then I did get attention that way.
Well,
So,
you have to cut through all the noise, right? Because when
yeah.
there's so much, information overload and
Well,
most.
as you have today, it's not just information overload, people passively overwhelmed. Now everybody makes their own TV station, their own podcast.
Right.
Everybody is an active broadcaster.
Yeah.
McLuhan used to say you'd be discarnate either actively or passively. Most people were passively, and they would like to have the experience of being actively discarnate by being on a TV show in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So people, that was a big goal for kids to want to be a journalist, to get on the media, to
Right.
experience being actively discarnate. You can listen to my first recording on the air, October 1st, 1984, with two friends. And it was really interesting and a neat experience to feel being on there and putting out stuff that supposedly people are interested in.
Oh yeah,
So you
for
get
sure.
a charge from it, an ecstasy, just by being discarnate, disembodied,
Mm.
and actively. So that is like an unforeseen Freudian desire that Freud hadn't anticipated. The desire to be in the electric space and be
Sure.
actively projecting stuff. So the democracy of the digital era has made everybody able to have the ecstasy of broadcast, though it's not as great as the 60s because it's all too fragmented and you don't have very big audiences.
Mm.
Back in the day, you could have, 30 million people be your audience. But still, getting out there and making your own material is a big reason why Trump happens, or why the fragmentation of everything happens, and the breakdown globally of the economy and everything. It's a bigger breakdown than radio, a bigger breakdown than what TV caused, and a bigger breakdown of the computer. We now have what's called the tech body. Did I talk about that with Hermitrix,
Yeah, yeah,
James?
I do remember that. Yeah. Then,
Yeah.
I think
And,
we're all aware that there's, this, like, the virtual self is fully realized, and it has a
and
body.
and and obsolesced by something like the Matrix tried to show you, in the way the tech body is Agent Smith. Millions of fucking little guys running around being a bot to you,
Mm.
and actually controlling your experience. And so we have an agenda now. My agenda is to help people adjust to the tech body, which is an extension of McLuhan and then Croker.
Mm.
They're early thinkers of what Ion calls the tech body. So, what is it about McLuhan? I've given you some basic points that aren't usually known.
Yeah.
What is something you want to ask about McLuhan that we haven't covered? Because I did
Well,
sort of say all this in the
yeah.
Herm thing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's just fascinating to go through the story and to talk through the ideas and all that. I'm I I'm not necessarily trying to get, the McLuhan story rather than just kind of discussing McLuhan-esque ideas
Yeah,
because that's essentially what I'm interested in, this idea of the progression of technology and the progression of language and what we just touched on with like everybody,
Mhm.
you know, becoming their own broadcasting and all that. I think that's super relevant. I don't want to, my brain keeps trying to like pull it back to Bitcoin, which is not necessarily what we need to talk about, but it is really relevant because Bitcoin is like this, it's like, it's the most hyper connected network, you know,
Yes.
and
Well,
so
with the Sam Bankman the freed bankman, right?
yes,
The
yeah,
freed banker. We did a whole bunch of stuff on last Thursday. What's this Sunday? In my private session,
mm.
very long private session with Ion, he explained the hidden ground of that phenomenon. Now he's a crypto exchange. That's different from a Bitcoin thing, right?
Well, so I think what I want to what would be interesting is like in the same way that the the new financial system, right, in
Yeah.
the 20s and 30s led to a completely different paradigm, right? Especially in
Now
terms
the
of power.
the
Yeah.
key sentence for that era is McLuhan said that the electric environment can't be bought, sold, or stolen. It's there as a new environment, like a new jungle,
Right.
and you can't own it. You can't buy it for yourself. Now,
Yes.
they
Yeah.
did do that in a fragmented way with pay TV, but for 20 years, it was this new landscape, new wilderness that money floundered around in.
Yeah.
Once TV started to take off in the late 50s, that's when they started to have problems in government in Canada, United States, and Britain, and the gold world got into a crisis because visual space really could not handle the what McLuhan called software communism of electric space, where everybody's sharing. So if wealth is something that you buy to get a neat experience, if the new experiences for most people is radio content and then TV content, and everybody's got relatively free access to it before pay TV, then everybody's sharing, everybody's equally wealthy because the majority of the wealth is the information environment,
Mm.
right? So that
Yeah.
upsets all measurement of Keynesian economics or any kind of measuring
Right.
of the economy.
Right.
So it was always crisis management from the late 50s on in economics with wage and price controls and arguing over that. And
Yeah.
all of it always failed because the electric environment can't be bought, sold, or stolen. It's wealth beyond money. So you're actually going back to aboriginal societies where everybody is living and just sharing the meat that you get. Well, the meat
Right.
you get is what's on the air, what's on the content entertainment.
Right. Well, I think that's really fascinating. There's an interview I did with another brilliant guy, Daniel Krawitz, who I feel you might enjoy that one. Um, and
You have a
I
website with these interviews.
yeah, they're all on YouTube. So
Okay.
and I'm going to be getting them on some you know, Bitcoin related services and stuff. So hopefully can earn a little bit of micropayments from that and all that. But no, he said that Bitcoin is like a new place that you can go
Yeah.
to. And
A
I'm
new
not
environment.
right,
Yes.
right, which is totally true. Like now the FTX and all that, an exchange is, you know, basically antithetical to like what I believe Bitcoin is really about, because it's not about having, you know, 1,000, you know, coins that you can arbitrage and trade off each other. It's about having a native thing that exists entirely in the digital or electric space that can basically act as like the most you know, sound money that human society has ever had. So
Right.
you now have the electric space having a uh, in the same way that the internet has like a foundation, you know, that is built on these like network protocols and then, you know, fiber optic cables underneath the ocean. In that same way, Bitcoin is like the uh, foundational element of a new digital space that is, you know, in all honesty, getting us ideally closer back to, you know, a more, I wouldn't, the reason why I'd say a more primitive lifestyle is in the sense that it ends, or it allows for people to perhaps escape the constant like layers of abstraction in life,
Yeah.
and that, like, your food being, behind 10 layers of like a process that you cannot see, feel, or touch, and that everything comes packaged, and all that. Not saying Bitcoin alone fixes that, but what it allows for is, like, for example, like a more localized economy, so that can, hopefully facilitate somebody getting a more local food supply.
Yeah, it brings back a kind of human scale.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because the technology handles the global scale for you,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that you can kind of be more local. Whereas, like, at the moment, we're in this half cyborg existence, where all the technology is like becoming, well, as you said, the tech body, which I'd like to, kind of hear more about. Sounds like a similar idea.
Right. So I used to engage Michael Blake Reed, and he channeled what was called the Evergreens, which I probably talked about on the Hermitrix thing, leading
Yeah.
into Ion, who's channeled by someone else. But I used to talk to McLuhan through the Evergreens, and McLuhan brought this idea, and he said, in the mechanical era or the industrial era, before you get to the digital, uh, the human was fragmented inside this industrial space. You had to be a specialist. Now, as that industrial technology shrinks in the digital, it becomes smaller than the human. The human gets reintegrated, and he's riding a system that he is just surfing on with no fragmentation. So Bitcoin allows you to have that big old industrial global world environment run by technology, and you are placed above it in a nowhere zone, but it can seem local,
Hmm.
and you can interact with people. So you retrieve local human scale. And that's what he predicted back in '88 when I talked to him. It was almost 40 years ago. He said the huge system that everybody had to fit into, and that was the alienating industrial big city world, that gets shrunk by the digital, and the little fragmented human rises above it, and he's bigger than the system. Whereas
Hmm.
industrially, you're a little cog in a big system. So it's actually flipped. And
Right.
so it's gone from fragmented to not fragmented. Now, the other thing you need is energy. How do you get rid of the oil, what I call oil consciousness? How do you get rid of oil as the driver of energy? You come up with something called free energy or endless electricity. And that's what me and Carolyn and Ion have invented.
Yeah.
And we've been talking about this for 10 years, but now the government is applying it, the American government, because they know the grid's going to collapse, and they want our system to be there to be the new ground of endless electricity for people. So that's a huge breakthrough in human history. All technologies up to that point are based on friction, and they're entropic. They wind down, they run out, and then you got to get more.
Yeah.
But if you have negentropic, non-entropic technologies, then it's not friction based. It doesn't wind down. So we've made the first frictionless technology. Now, that's a major announcement. We've been talking about our race over 10 years. We had to wait till the authorities, the Homeland Security, and everybody else get hip to what we have, believe it. We allow them to see it without them stealing it, because they will steal it from you. And so we had to be very careful, and it took 10 years to do it. And also the system had to collapse more and more. And now it's a perfect meeting point where the system is pretty well threatening everybody. And I mean, what is it? The Hoover Dam is running out of water. You won't have any electricity in the whole LA area.
Oh,
Think of
yeah.
that. Well, that's your area. you're
Yeah.
you're doomed.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, you know about that, the Hoover
I did.
Dam?
Well, and all the rivers are under
Yeah.
in big trouble right now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so you have this. Now you're going to love me because I'm going to keep you guys going. We'll just put our box in there, and it'll start. It's very powerful. It can do a lot with a little box, cover
Mm.
a lot of area. So because we have that technology and no one else has it, and they can't get it from us, so we're in charge. that makes me and Carolyn and JW the richest people in the world, or the most powerful, because we have the new environment. Just like, Gates and Jobs, they made the new environment, the digital environment. And then they put American literate sensibility on it, hijacked it, and claimed to own it, right?
Mm.
Even though the electronic can't be bought and sold, stolen, stolen, what would McLuhan say about the digital? You could pretend to own the electric environment if you have a digital ground that allows you to be in this autonomous, non-merged condition of electric media. The digital allows you to separate and float around like a spaceship
Yeah.
and float above the electronic grid, right?
Right.
And
Right.
then you can claim you own it. So that's what we got, the Silicon Valley megaliths. So all of that, though, it will be threatened by our technology and other things we're coming up with, because we have extra help. And it's the most fantastic story, if you believe it. It's the most fantastic story in history that we got non-physical to help us invent this stuff. And we invented it. And now all the aspects of the elite of the world, who just visited me recently? Mr. Rothschild, because this digital Bitcoin reality was wiping out the old banking network, and they overextend themselves. So they didn't have any wealth anymore. So what do? They find out about us, and they want to get at the table with us. They want to join our thing. So Mr. Rothschild offered me $300 million, but we're not taking any money. We don't need it. So others were meeting with JW, our partner in this, and they're offering this big amount because if we take it, then they are allowed to be in the meetings of the board or something. They can feel they have certain conditions that we have to meet, but that's the beginning of them sneaking in, taking over the board, and then kicking us out or something. So we do not let that happen. So Mr. Rothschild, he was so depressed, he fucking went home and died. He just died. He just died the other day.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Did you know he died?
I think
Did you hear
I
about
think I heard about that. Yeah.
Now that's a typical reality today. What you're saying, most people say, "Yeah, I think I heard about that," because there's so much stuff you're hearing about. It just all flies by, right? So you
Absolutely.
go, "Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
I heard of that." And if you just heard about it, that's all. That's being informed.
Right.
Yeah, I heard about that. So now that's an important the fourth key point about McLuhan. That's an important thing. He used to say that people didn't turn on back in the 60s. They didn't turn on the radio in the morning to experience content. They knew there was a new space, quoting your Bitcoin buddy, and everybody would join that space in the morning to experience communally whatever the space offered. And
Right.
it was more being in the space than what was on. So you had this curious thing of people making millions as pop stars and all that, but they're transitory and they're not really what people are focused on. If people will continue turning on the radio in the 60s and 70s and 80s to experience whatever was happening while the stars came and went. Andy Warhol, you're famous for 15 minutes, But the important thing is it's a new space and you don't feel connected to what's going on in the world unless you join in the space. So you got to turn on the radio and see what they're talking about
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
share the same space, to experience it. So that's really important. When I got that about McLuhan, that changes your view of the content battles. That the real thing people are addicted to is they've got to share this new electric space, this discarnate, disembodied condition. That is the addiction of electric media. That's what holds people. So you really got to get that content is ephemeral. It's transitory, and you can have what we have today, millions of nobodies broadcasting their opinions about things, all
Yeah.
reacting to a centralized news headline matrix. And actually, why do people listen to nobodies? To experience the space. So it's so voluminous, so many fragmented spaces or blog spaces that you just need 1,000 people. And if you got something going and they buy it, you can make a livelihood out of it. So
Right.
that's a very tiny number of people when you got billions. So people are living in little bubbles, but they have to have some favorite blogger or something so that they experience the digital space like we're creating right now and sharing. We are sharing the digital space. We're being actively making distracting content for it. But as a Manipian, I'll remind people that we're in a space that's going to do you
Oh
in
yeah.
the long run.
Yeah. I think this will be you know, very educational for anybody who listens to it. And you know, it'll certainly be entertaining and fun. And I think probably gonna cut it here. I think that was fantastic conversation. I really hope that we can do a second part and
No
dive
problem.
into I'd love to talk about Ion and
Yes.
JW and definitely hit on a lot of go a little deeper on these topics because I feel like I mean it's so interesting. So much of what you said has almost run completely in parallel with how I've been essentially seeing the future, you know?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
it's remarkable that you can follow a lot of these same ideas going back, you know, almost 100 years now
Yep.
through McLuhan's writings. And I'll certainly take a look. And even before with Wyndham Lewis and all that sort of stuff. So,
Yeah, I would say that McLuhan, he always said he wasn't a genius. He did notice what other people didn't notice. He said because he was lucky, he met interesting people, Wyndham Lewis and that, so that he had experiences that no one had informationally. And he didn't present his point of view. He was just describing the environment. And everybody would eventually should read McLuhan and realize, oh, that's what I kind of intuited, but no one ever said it out to me. And
yeah,
so it's a collective knowledge that I'm presenting, replaying McLuhan's collective knowledge. And you find out, as you just said, well, I kind of half knew this stuff because I was experiencing it. And especially more and more people know McLuhan in the last 20 years since he was on Wired. These McLuhan ideas are more in the media now. You know what I mean? He's quoted a lot now.
yeah, for sure. All
So
right.
that's yeah, I'm articulating a collective ESP that's going on.
Thank you so much, Bob. Really, really great to have you on. And we'll definitely do a part two.
Yeah, I look forward to part 2 with Sharish.
Yes, sir.